We're answering your questions about the Hoosier State as part of our Inquire Indiana project. A Bloomington resident asked us to find out more about the history of racism and hate groups in Indiana and their impact on our lives today.
I was interested in learning more about racism and in Indiana specifically, and the after effects of that, so Jim Crow and segregation and all of those kind of things, because I feel that we don't talk about that stuff, and it's an important part of our history, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it, because without talking about it, we're not going to address the issues that are happening today.
As Barbara Brozier reports, that history in Indiana is long and complicated.
Though it's evolved over the years, racism's been a constant in Indiana history. It's been around much longer than the state itself. But we see the attitudes manifest in Indiana's first constitution in 1816. While it prohibited slavery, it also didn't allow black men to vote.
And in many other ways, the pioneers at the very beginning excluded African Americans from citizenship and from full participation in everyday life in Indiana. And that pattern laid down at the very beginning persisted into the 20th century.
The Ku Klux Klan became powerful in Indiana in the 1920s, when it had significant influence over state politics. In 1924, voters elected Edward Jackson as governor, who was rumored to be a Klan member because of his close ties with Indiana Klan leader D.C. Stevenson.
The Klan had many enemies. Certainly the Klan's enemies included African Americans, but the Klan enemies also include Jewish Hoosiers, and above all, and most importantly, Catholics and immigrants. And many immigrants were Catholics. They came from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, Italian Americans, Polish Americans. And the Klan in Indiana in the 1920s labeled them as the people most responsible for tearing down America, for taking America off the good path that it was on and tearing it down.
It was during that same decade that Indianapolis opened its first and only all-black high school, Crispus Attucks.
When it first was built, it was built out of racism. The school board members at that time were Ku Klux Klan members. They did not want white students and black students going to high school together.
Patricia Payne's parents were in the first two graduating classes, and their pictures still hang on the walls.
My father was in the first graduating class of Crispus Attucks. That was 1928.
While the school was born out of racism, Payne says it became a symbol of strength for the black community. Many of the teachers were university professors who couldn't get jobs elsewhere. They challenged and encouraged the students, who left the school culturally and academically prepared.
What happened was we took lemons and made lemonade.
Now there's a museum in the high school that tells the story of much more than Crispus Attucks. It starts as far back as ancient Egypt.
The museum is important also because we make sure that all children who come here understand that the history of black people did not start on a plantation in America.
The exhibits on the walls are far from the only evidence of racism we can find today in Indiana. It's clear in the makeup of school systems, neighborhoods, and jail populations. Decisions made decades ago are still having an impact today, like the decision Indianapolis city leaders made in the 1970s to unify Marion County and Indianapolis governments, but not the school systems.
You look at what it did to public education and how, in many ways, the divisiveness we have with school districts that we now determine IPS and then suburban districts, if you will, which are really not all that suburban anymore, really shifted issues around access and issues around parity and quality and equity that unfortunately have fallen along racial lines.
And as you follow the path of I-65 and I-70, you'll travel right through the middle of what once were vibrant black communities in Indianapolis, torn apart to make way for the roads.
And I can still see my parents sitting on the bed crying when they were told, and I guess it's called eminent domain, when they were told we had to move. Now this is the house we had grown up in. And right now the highway goes right through where and that happens in a lot of black communities where that highway goes right through and disrupts the entire neighborhoods.
I don't know how you ever really rebound from that, at least not in a short amount of time, because it then begins to create certain impediments and barriers for other economic development, because when you do infrastructure that really begins to define what's possible, it makes it very difficult to get not only economies of scale, but really the type of critical mass of resources that will allow certain communities and neighborhoods to be vibrant again.
Those scars make it hard for Indiana to buck the reputation of being a closed-minded, sometimes racist state. Just last year, the KKK held a rally in Madison, but the event drew far more protesters.
Across the state in small towns, I sense that there is a movement toward more acceptance and a movement against hatred and dismissiveness toward those who are different.
Madison says that's what it will take for Indiana to rewrite its reputation. Hoosiers standing up and demanding change.
Any problems we have today, just like the problems we had when the Klan was in power in Indiana in 1924, are really our fault as citizens. This is a democracy, and it's up to the people to decide what we want.
And Barbara joins us again. Well, this is a topic you could just talk all day about, isn't it?
Unfortunately, it is. You know, racism is a complicated issue. We barely scratched the surface with our story, which had some examples in Indianapolis. But of course, racism is not confined to one community. It happens everywhere, not just urban or rural areas.
And some people tend to think of Martinsville as an area that's associated with racism. Where does that come from?
That's one of the first things I heard when I moved to Bloomington, is that was what someone told me about Martinsville. And where that comes from, a lot of people point to back in the 1960s. That's when 21-year-old Carol Jenkins Davis was actually stabbed to death, a young black woman who was selling encyclopedias in Martinsville. The man arrested for that murder actually died before the case ever went to trial. And so there was no sense of justice in that sense. And then on top of that, the city has just struggled with that reputation of possibly being a racist or hateful community since then because of several things that have happened. You see video now from a ceremony where the community honored Jenkins Davis. They put a memorial stone and a tree in her honor, but that was after some years of opposition to doing something to memorialize her. So it's hard to buck that reputation, but a lot of communities are trying really hard to do so.
Barbara, thank you so much.